Welcome back to another lesson with Mrs. Taranjo. We are starting a new unit today. We are in Domain 3 and we're going to do all about poetry. So today is Lesson 1, To the Snake. Our objectives for today are to identify and define the basic elements of a poem structure and to discuss those poetic devices in the poem To the Snake. And we're going to compose our own apostrophe poem. Some key vocabulary for today. We're doing glinting, which is sparkling or shining. Pulsing, throbbing rhythmically like a heart beating. Awake, a trail of disturbed water or air left by the passage of a ship or aircraft. Apostrophe, writing that addresses a person or thing that is not present. Content, the words or subject of a piece of writing. Form, the shape and structure or appearance of a writing. A line break, the place where a line ends. Stanza is a section of a poem that consists of a line or group of lines, and a stanza break is the blank space that divides two stanzas from each other. So before we read our poem today, we have a few things we're going to do, but before we actually read the poem, I'm going to go and show you what some of those forms mean for poems. So before we do that, we're going to introduce poetry. So people have many different opinions about poetry, but one of the most famous is by Emily Dickinson. She wrote, if I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. So that's the most famous quote when it comes to discussing how poetry feels. So this whole unit, we're going to be talking about what poetry is, and we're going to explore our own reactions to it. So before we get into reading a poem, we're going to actually be discussing the author or poet of each poem before we get into the poem, because it's really important to know who that person is and where they came from. It can start giving us an idea of why they might have written that poem. So this is Denise Levertov, and she's the author of the poem we're going to read today. Denise Levertov was born in 1923 in Essex, United Kingdom. At a young age, she knew writing would be her future. I lived in a house full of books, and everybody in my family did some kind of writing. It seemed natural for me to be writing something. I wrote poems from an early age and stories, she recalled. Her mother encouraged her to send poems to this poet, T.S. Eliot, and at age 17, she published the Double Image, her first collection of poetry. In 1947, Levertov moved to the United States and continued publishing poetry. Influenced by the writing of William Carlos Williams, she began to experiment with a style of imagery that transformed everyday objects into something remarkable and new. Her collections of poetry include The Sorrow Dance, To Stay Alive, and Freeing Dust, earned many awards. She continued to write and teach until her death in 1997. So today the poem we're going to be focusing on is To the Snake. But before we get into this, I wanted to talk a little bit about those vocabulary words because a lot of times we're going to be referring to them in future poems, so it's important to know what they are. So going back, so the first one is the form. So the form is the shape of the poem. So you can notice how the shape shows, there's spacings, there's indentations here. All of these are examples of the form that this poem is written in. Line break is where the line ends. So this is considered a line. So the line break is here and goes to the next line. Typically, if we were writing like an essay or something, the sentence doesn't stop until the line doesn't end until the sentence ends. In this one, you can see that they kind of broke off even though the sentence wasn't over. That's what a line break is. Then we have a stanza, which is the section of poem. So you can tell from this, we have a section out here, and you see this kind of big gap. This is actually the second stanza, and it looks like here we have a third stanza. So it's basically the break between the paragraphs, and it's pretty easy to determine when you're looking at a poem because there's a good space usually between them. And then a stanza, I believe it's a stanza break. Make sure. Yep, a stanza break divides the two, is the blank space that divides the two stanzas. So as I was saying, this is a stanza. This piece, this huge empty space right here, that would be a stanza break. So it's really important to remember those terms because throughout the unit, we'll probably be referring to it in those terms. So that way you understand what a stanza is, what a line is, and things like that. So now is going to be your chance to read the poem. Feel free to stop the video at any time to reread the poem. It is very important that when you're reading a poem, we read it more than once, especially because sometimes the language is a little bit tricky to understand, and it's sometimes easier just to basically understand a poem better. So I'm going to give you about 5 seconds on my end, but feel free to pause the video at any time. Okay. So, who or what is being addressed in the poem's title? The green snake is being addressed. How does the speaker describe the green snake in stanza 1? So for this one, we needed to refer back to that first stanza. Remember, that's that first grouping of lines that's described as green, hissing, glinting, and dry. According to stanza 2, what did the speaker tell her companion she believes about the snake? She believes the snake was harmless. The speaker then tells the snake, but truly I had no certainty. What did the speaker really believe about the snake? She did not know if it would hurt her or not. And why did the speaker decide to hold the snake? She thought it would make her happy or bring her that joy. So these are just some questions that help us kind of guide our thinking when we're analyzing a poem. So when we're talking about poetry, there's some specific terms that describe the parts of a poem. So stories and essays are usually written in paragraphs. Many of the grammatical rules that are followed in normal, typically essay writing, is not followed in poetry because poets really like to play around with their writing. They play with sounds, meaning, format, all of those things in order to make their poem more unique. So poetry may contain sentences, but it's usually written in lines, and it does not follow the same rules of capitalization and punctuation with prose writing, so fiction and nonfiction. So sometimes they might not capitalize things. Sometimes they might. Sometimes they might leave out a period here, or maybe they won't have any punctuation at all. That's where it comes with the poet's creativity. Poetry gives poets permission and freedom to play with the language in order to select beautiful words and express emotion, create images in your head without worrying about following the rules of grammar. So for the poem that we just read, there's actually 16 lines in that poem, but 9 of those lines were just the first sentence. So it's definitely different than our typical writing that we've been doing, because typically a first sentence would be 1 line. This is 9 lines, so it's a definite different format than what we're used to. Poets often end lines on important words because they want to add emphasis on those words. Sometimes they also end lines in a place where they wouldn't naturally pause, and we kind of talked about that with that line break, how even though the sentence didn't end, they broke the sentence off. That was the line break that we talked about. Those stories or essays organize sentences into paragraphs, poem organize lines into stanzas. We talked about that as well, and how the stanza break breaks up those format that looks like paragraphs. Levertov's poem has 1 stanza break. It occurs after ears and then breaks before and after line, which left are not stanza breaks because there are no extra space between the lines. Therefore, it has 2 stanzas. So I actually made a mistake when I was going through the poem. It only actually has this 1 very large break here. So I apologize, I made that mistake. So this is stanza 1 and stanza 2. And so when we speak of the shape, structure of a piece of writing, we're going to be discussing its form. So that's what that means. So this poem is an example of a kind of poem. It's called an apostrophe. So you may know an apostrophe is a form of punctuation. So the apostrophe for this example would be like down here in this word. This is an example of an apostrophe, but that's not what it means in a poem. So we're not just writing a poem with a bunch of those little marks above your words. There's actually a reason for it. An apostrophe poem is a poem that addresses a thing or person who is not there. So they're not present. Levertov's poem, therefore, it functions as an apostrophe by addressing the snake that is not present. Levertov began writing poems when she was a little young girl, and today you're going to write your own apostrophes. So to get started, you're going to think about different things you might want to address in the poem. So you're going to list different animals that you've interacted with or seen with, and you should name you should name how you've known or experienced that animal. So these are some examples. So feel free to use them, but I would like you to be a little bit more creative and see if you can come up with things on your own. So you might have experienced a time your neighbor dog barked at you. You might have, saw a rat looking for food in the subway. You might have seen a monkey at the zoo. You might have a pet at home that likes to cuddle. Those are examples of animals and your interaction with them. So you have to have the animal choice that you chose, as well as how did you interact with them? What was the experience with them? This is your planning. So now you're going to use those ideas and you're going to pick one of those experiences you came up with, and you're going to think about these things. What is the animal you're writing about? Where did you see it? Did you hear, smell, touch the animal? You're going to write down how you experience the animal. So I talked about that. So for example, I have a cat at home. I, pet the cat when she's in a good mood. That's how I would have experienced that animal. So if you did more than one of those things, write as many as necessary. So, okay, my cat likes to hiss at people sometimes when she's scared. So that's another experience. So I don't have to just write, yeah, I pet her when she's happy. I've also experienced her when she's mad. So I can include as many of those experiences as I want in my poem. What did the animal do when you were around it? Same thing that goes along with that experience. And what would you tell the animal now that the two of you are no longer together? So that is kind of what your apostrophe poem is going to look like. So that is your assessment for today. You're going to be drafting that poem. So your draft should include a title for your poem. So remember, titles tell what that poem is going to be about. Your next line, so you're going to have 2 stanzas, and if you forget what a stanza is, feel free to go back in this video and review it. On the lines for stanza 1, you're going to write when and how you experience the animal. And then on stanza 2, you're going to write about what the animal did when it was around you and what you'd want to say to it now. So this is your assessment. When you have your draft, feel free to send it to your teacher so that they can look it over. So remember, this is your assessment, so this is how we're going to check your work. And we will see everyone in our next lesson.